Sure, and thank you, Wolfgang, and thank you for reminding me about the conference in Nice when my boss at the time asked that question. And I think that's still the question that we ask at the Department of Commerce. The work that we've done on this in the past has been very specific in a different part of the building on RFID and working on those kinds of issues. But I think for us, the question still is, what is the Internet of Things? And it encompasses lots of different components and different networks. And I think from our perspective, you've launched a very aggressive and complete work program, which I think is to be admired, and you guys are really taking a look at it. We haven't seen the same demand from our stakeholders domestically as a collective, and we also sort of question, well, what is the role of government in that regard? So we haven't really been doing and looking into it because we still sort of struggle with what is the definition of the Internet of Things and what are we talking about. And a few years ago we were at that conference, and there was one other conference I attended soon after because we were taking a look at it, and one of the panelists had said, it was a similar kind of conversation, what is it we're talking about and what does everyone want to do? And one of the panelists said, I think what's missing is the wow factor. Everyone has the wow factor of what was my first experience on the internet, right? And so people aren't really able to relate that to the Internet of Things yet. And I think that might be one of the things that, it'll be interesting to see what folks have to say. Maybe there's been a lot of evolution in the last couple of years, but from our perspective, we really haven't actively engaged in a construct or discussion of the Internet of Things. I think in terms of governance structures, it'll be interesting to hear different people talk about it, but there's different components to this. We're talking about different types of networks. They can be closed user groups. They can rely on the existing infrastructures. There's lots of different component parts, and so I think it'll be interesting to sort of see, where the conversation goes from there. And maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, I think this is a good start. So we see we have not the answers to that. So we have more and more questions on the table, and it starts with the definition. And Avri Doria was part of this research group under the EuroNF research project, and we also had within these 2 years a lot of discussion about the definition, what is the subject, and probably Avri can summarize a little bit what we have done, and then we hand over to Bob and Patricia.
Thank you. Yes, I was actually fortunate to be the American in the European work, so one place where things start to come together. We did start with exactly that question of how do we define it, and found that many of the people in the group really did have different views of it. But once we stepped back a little bit, first of all, we looked at the word Internet and the Internet of Things related more to the little I Internet. In other words, it was a network of networks. And it was a network of networks more at the application layer, or in the sense of the relationships between objects, the services of objects, and the users of those. But once you accepted that this was indeed an internet, but it was an Internet of Things, and it's something that's had many names before, and it'll probably have many names again in some sense. I think of the Internet of Things as the fashionable name for this overlay network of dealing with objects, dealing with the relationships between those objects, dealing with the relationships of those objects to the users of the objects, and following those objects through a complete life cycle. Now, as it does that, basically, you find that this overlay network is sometimes actually over the internet. It sometimes is subject to the internet and using the internet's names, addressing, subject to its architecture, and all of the principles and issues that brings up. At other times, it may be over a sensor network, where the protocol structure and the rules and principles of the internet are overwhelming and couldn't possibly apply. At other times, it may be over other private networks that perhaps use an IP protocol but are not subject to the same naming and addressing constraints as the global unique internet. And so one of the advantages of an overlay network is it can do that. It can deal with that. One of the disadvantages of it is that there's no coordination of these things. So as an object or the representation of something moves from being in one network to being in another, but still in that, how is all that information, how are the policies, how are the protocols basically connected? and you find yourself in a position where you start to need a notion of an architecture, both of how the technical pieces play together, how you gateway, as it were, from one set of technology principles and protocols to another set of technology and principles, but also you need to have a governance architecture that sort of helps you move from the policies that are inherent in one network type to the policies that are inherent. And if you're going to build a coherent Internet of Things that deals with issues like, not only are we talking about things, remember, but we're talking about the relationship of those things to the users, and at various times a user becomes someone that is surrounded by many things that enables that user to be tracked through time and space, and of course that bringing in all the privacy and other related human rights issues that kind of presence brings. You really need a more coordinated view of it. So basically what came out of this initial project was a way of looking at the Internet of Things without everybody having to say, but that's not the Internet, which is the substructure. True, it's an overlay Internet of its own kind, and therefore it's something that once we start to understand it, we need to really figure out both the technical and the policy governance architecture of that. So that's where I would leave it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Avery. This was a very good and clear orientation also for the future discussion. And I think Patricia or Bob, you lead us one step further down into this unknown territory.
Okay, I'll start. Oh, excuse me.
You
want to start? Okay.
I just wanted to respond to Avery just briefly. I normally relate very well to the points that you bring up at these meetings, but I kind of have the anti-Avery view of what you just said. Sort of each of the positions you took, I was saying, no, it's exactly the opposite. And so there's this dimension of these that we could spend a lot of time talking about, and I hope we will later.
Yeah, Patricia.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I'm Patrice Lyons. I'm with CNRI, and we've spent, as you know, a good deal of time over years and years and years. And part of the exercise early on, I hadn't really wanted to start with what it means to be the Internet, but you've teed the issue up. Big I, little I, all caps. I mean, we had a trademark battle for 10 years where, you know, it's generic. It doesn't matter. Big I, little I, all caps. In the 1990s, the folks that brought you the Internet got together and had a definition, Bob, Vint, and a whole group of them. And this is the days in the Federal Networking Conference. You can still find it, FNC, Internet Definition. And they obviously thought it was a global information system. You know, it wasn't any particular net. And this is becoming far more obvious today when you get into apps and app stores and, you know, the actual more dynamic things that go beyond the web, and the web's just a big app in that context. Naming and addressing, that's not, obviously there were first guesses made about naming and addressing. Bob chose the DNS back in 1983. But things have moved well beyond that. And so right now you have numerous different kinds of information systems that live very nicely on the Internet. If you have an IP network, that's just another part of the Internet. Okay, so I don't want to go down that too far because that really hadn't been what I thought we were going to be discussing this morning. I'm pleased to take that offline because we've written and worked upon that for gosh, well on 30 years. And so I share Bob's concern. I would have to discuss with you each element of your perceptions there. And that's healthy in a group like this because I think that's one of the strengths of the IGF, to allow for these kind of exchanges and perhaps reach some understandings. But I wanted to start with the Internet as a global information system, okay? And as a global information system, essentially the representation is in digital form. The devices and everything in that environment, they don't speak Swahili. You know, you're down to the bits and the management of the bits. But let me focus now on what it means to be a thing in this context. Okay, since I've been in Kenya, I've been talking to a lot of folks about the mobile Internet because this has gone very, very popular here. And I have a phone that's not as smart as some of the folks have, but I think most people would say this is a thing. Okay, now in this thing, there's a SIM chip. And as I understand, and I haven't done a real in-depth research on it, the SIM chip has an identifier. That's information. The plastic and silicon are the thing. Okay, so the identifier is embedded or associated with that object. But in that sense, it's information as information is in any kind of Internet implementation. And I would suggest that here they're using that in conjunction with registries, where they register their identification, and then they use that as a type of personal identifier for paying their electric bill and sending money to their relatives in rural areas. And so I would suggest that that's all part of the Internet. And the protocols and procedures and the identification systems, we've been focusing more particularly on the interoperability of what's been termed heterogeneous information systems in that context. And whether or not they're made available in a thing, you're still talking about information represented in digital form. You mentioned sensor nets. That was one of my examples. And I was going to say a sensor net, a buoy bobbing up and down in the Pacific where they're measuring waveforms. The buoy has an identifier and the sensor has identification information. And Bob, perhaps you might want to say some more from a technical perspective on that. Well, actually, I was going to move along. I had a lot more examples. I know last year at our Dynamic Coalition, I mentioned my favorite one about bills of lading in global commerce, where you have the RFID on the crate or the container that's strapped on the ship at sea. But that's just an information source, because the RFID, the identifier, is just information associated with the crate. It's not the thing, it's the information. And one of the beauties of that is if you can have interoperability, you can associate that identification or other information that may be collected with identification in the banking and insurance that's all relevant to the particular cargo. So you reconceptualize what it means to be a bill of lading in a much more dynamic sense than just simply taking a bill of lading, getting rid of the paper and say, here we have the value, and okay, so now we're in the new world of the Internet. What I'm trying to do is look at it as a new capability that can be enhanced. And things are all over the place in that context, whether you have a piece of paper, which is a thing, or you have a smartphone, which is a thing, or a crate strapped to a boat in the Atlantic. But Bob, I think I've said my piece here. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, Bob, you want to continue? No?
Well, I guess there's a question for you, Wolfgang. Do you want to get in? What I was going to talk about was the whole issue of interoperability and some of that trust. The question is this the right time for that level of discussion, or do you want to amplify on these issues of the definition of what things are? I mean, I can talk a little to that right now and get into the other later.
Probably Massimiliano, do you want to speak now, or should we first continue with Bob? Bob, go ahead.
Well, okay, then let me break this presentation into two parts. One, I'm going to give you my take on what we're talking about things. And I think there are two aspects of it, assuming you're talking about a thing. One, how do you know what it is you're talking to? How do you trust that it's what you think it is? And how do you get interoperability between different systems that are managing things more globally? And we're not going to have a single metadata standard for the world, and even if we did now, we will change over time. So we're going to need to factor all of that in. I mean, to me, when I think of something that's a thing, I think that word is normally used to mean something that is like this bottle or this piece of the microphone system that's in here. As Patrice mentioned, it could be a sensor at sea and a buoy of some sort. And so I break down sort of what the thing is from what the information that there might be about the thing. I mean, these things in principle don't do anything. They're inanimate objects of some sort or another. And it's what's inside and the interactions with them that are really relevant. So the information about the things is pretty critical to understand what you're dealing with. But then the things that are the most interesting things actually can produce information or maybe even accept information in both directions. So you really need to distinguish between all three of those. So if, for example, we say, Wolfgang, you're a thing, okay? Whether you like that notion or not, I can ask, what? I mean, you're not plugged into the internet in terms of your DNA, so
Not yet.
and probably never will be. But to the extent that you're a thing, we can ask, well, what's the information about this thing called Wolfgang? So he's about so high, and he comes from Denmark or Leipzig or someplace, and he maybe went to school here, maybe here's where we live, here contact information. That's all metadata about this thing called Wolfgang. But now Wolfgang has this interesting capability of producing information. Like you can write papers, you can say things, you can have ideas, and those are related to the thing, but it's not the thing. And so that's one example. Now, if I take the sensor in the ocean, same thing. Who manufactured it? What's it measuring? If it produces any output, how's it structured? How's it formatted? What's the lifetime of its battery? I mean, all these things are information about the sensor. And then there's what the sensor itself produces, which might be, as Patrice mentioned, it could be, wave motions in the ocean. It could be temperatures. It could be any variety of things that sensor was designed to detect. That's typically what you want to know. In practice, this is exactly what today's internet does, except that we're talking here more about managing information than we are about moving bits. So in the original internet context, our focus was almost entirely about how do we get whatever we have here in packetized form to some other place without having to go through all the machinery of figuring out where's the other place and how do I route it and what protocols are they using and the like. So I think we pretty much slam dunked that, at least for the short term. But ultimately, it was up to people to navigate this. Fingers on keyboards. If you go back to the original ARPANET, just to go back in history a bit, you could argue that was a network of things, because the only things that were connected to this were these machines. And the machines didn't do anything. They just sort of sat there and either took bits in or put bits out. It was what went on inside the machines that was really important. And that was almost always navigated by people with fingers on keyboards, or another machine interacting with it at the application area. So we've been dealing with things for a long time, and I think the current view of things is really no different. And so as we strive to find different formulas for governance, or different formulas for managing things, or different ways of achieving trust, I don't think it's any different than the normal problems we have in today's internet. So if I'm dealing with a medical information facility, I want to know I'm dealing with the right place. I want to know that the information I'm getting from them is the authentic information. They probably want to know that I am who I am in order to release it to me. And that gets into a far more intricate set of issues about identity and trust in the identity as well. So if you imagine a world where everything, and by thing, I'm now going to represent it more broadly to say a program on a computer could be viewed as a thing. It's sort of more incorporeal than a bottle of water. But the bottle of water is not the same as the water that's inside of it. It's a higher level representation. This identity is only as trustworthy as the party that stands up for it. Now, historically, we've dealt with things like X509 certificates and the like, and certificating authorities. But I think as we move down in the future, we're going to find lots more parties that are creating identifiers for things. And been a whole series of discussions around the formulation of what are called trust authorities, or trust frameworks. And those trust frameworks are intended to be trusted parties that will deal with identity. The problem, for example, within the U.S. government, there are various parties that will authenticate individuals, and then they'll issue them cards that have certain identifiers that will validate them. And they may go through serious background checks. They could be, family checks, they could be fingerprinting, they could be retina scans, they could be DNA analysis, they could be very much in-depth, and there could be other trust authorities that don't do very much at all. I show up, say I'm Mickey Mouse, they give me an identifier, and we're done. So ultimately, it's not enough to have a trust authority. You need a way to then validate the trust authority, or at least understand what they do. And so that's one of the issues I've been very deeply involved with, is if a trust authority were to assert something about an identifier, how do you go about validating a trust authority that you've never seen, heard of, or dealt with before? So you want to know a certain number of things about that entity. And you can view that as a thing as well, although let's view it not as a thing for the purpose of this discussion. But you'd certainly like to know as a minimum, what did they do to validate this? You know, did they do extensive testing? Were they authoritative? And probably you'll have a whole social eco-structure and system of places that are willing to assert who does a good job of identity generation. So you might go to your favorite one and see if they list this trust authority on there, and if they do, maybe you just accept it, or maybe you accept it for the first order, but then you still want to see what they've done, because this might be, you know, the equivalent of a gold medallion signature on something you really want to be sure, or not. So trust and interoperability are really the two things I want to focus on. Let's.
Do you want to say something about we can agree with her, Fiona, that was the notion of an architecture.
No, I don't want to get into that yet. So let me pick on the notion of RFID tags and crates. I think that was one of the topics that was brought up here. There are a couple of ways that you can approach that problem. One is to say that the RFID tag is just simply a mechanism for identity that you stick on something. So you can put it on this crate, and now somebody somewhere else can maintain manifests about what's in the crate. Or you can put an RFID tag on something where it's bound to what's in that crate and is unchangeable, sort of an immutable object that's in the crate. And therefore, if that crate were, let's say, a package for a book, to me, the ideal identifier that's in that RFID tag is the identifier for the data structure that's the book, which is inside that crate. That to me would be the right thing to do. On the other hand, you could say, well, it's just an identifier for this crate, and we don't know anything about what's inside the crate because I pulled a random RFID chip. Now, somebody else has got to go to the process of figuring out how to map that identifier into information about what's inside that crate, and that, in principle, could change over time. So those are things I think that can get sorted out in the different industries, you know, as to what they mean and what they want. I think if you took the book industry, you'll find they have extensive metadata registries about their information. So the last thing they want to do is go through 2 or 3 levels of indirection to have to get to the information about the book when they already have those metadata registries. But my guess is we'll go through those iterations for a few generations until they finally decide on what's the most efficient thing to do. Ideally, you know, the closer you can get to the end thing right off the bat and still be flexible enough in the operation of the overall system, that would be the best choice. But you have different parties looking at different parts of the puzzle, and they may decide to deal with the identification one way because that's the way things are done, and then 10 years later there's a different way, and so they try to switch it in that. And you may have these different systems coexisting with each other for a very long time. Now, the final thing I want to say is about interoperability. If you have a whole system where things and information about the things and the like are described in one metadata regime, and then somebody else later comes along with another description in another metadata regime, one possibility is that people keep going back and keep recasting their old metadata in the new format so everything is compatible. But that's a big burden, especially on all the older stuff and some stuff that won't make any sense to do it, but it will still be every now and then useful to know about. So I think getting some idea of how to get interoperability between these different metadata schemes is really the most fundamental task that we need to work on. And I think the only way to work on it is at a meta level. That is, I don't think tackling the problem of mapping this metadata structure into that one is a solvable problem because there are too many combinations. You're into an n-squared problem of mapping everything into everything else. Rather, I think what we need is a higher level means of describing metadata that can be understood independent of the particular choice of the metadata schema, and then having a semantic way of correlating different linguistic descriptions. This is a problem that's been dealt with for a long time in the medical community. In the U.S., the National Library of Medicine, on whose board of regents I sat for many years, spent a lot of time developing something called the medical subject headings, so-called mesh headings. It's sort of a standard agreed linguistic description of medical conditions that might get mapped in lots of different ways in different systems. So at the top level, heart attack was never one of the entries, but the medical terms were, myocardial infarction or angina pectoris or whatever the formal medical terms were, and they could get mapped and semantically understood. So I think if we get the right meta-level structures in place, we can then turn that problem into one of semantics in the different disciplines to really understand it. But I think, ultimately we want to put the responsibility for creating all this metadata and managing the metadata in the hands of people who either provide the equipment or provide the services or are developing the outputs, you for your papers, the pineapple juice company for their pineapple juice, and so forth. So let me just stop there. We can get a lot more detail technically on how one might do that, but I think those are the basic primitives. I don't see any need for different governance structures. I don't think it's really different than the internet. On the other hand, it's a different domain to think about, so people are normally inclined to go and think, well, this is really different, let's figure out how to structure it. But it really isn't.
I think it was very helpful also to understand that there is no need to reinvent the wheel. That means if we have already, let's say, general policies or structures, governance structures in place, then the question is whether new applications, new layers can be managed on the basis of the existing mechanism, or what has to be adjusted. And I think, a workshop like this one can probably help to identify whether there is a problem or not. So it's good to ask the question, but the question does not mean that we answer the question with yes. It can be also no, or we do not yet know. So that means.
Well, let me mention one particular thing in what Avery had said that I would take on, straight away, which is, she was describing the Internet of Things as an overlay. Okay, to me, it's just another use of the current Internet. So I don't see where the notion of overlay even comes into play. And frankly, the notion of overlay is a loaded term, because in the history of the Internet, there's always been this notion of layered protocols, and it had a very good rationale for its creation when we did. But the notion of layering has usually been applied to groups who are trying to build on something else that somebody else did. So when you take a structure like the Internet itself and you pick a dimension of it where people are trying to improve its functionality or its capability, it may not be layered on. There are many things that are integrated with what's there before to provide new functionality and capability. And I think this is a case where much of what we're talking about is just going to be the normal use of the Internet or things that are integrated with the current Internet. Now, there may be things that are layered on, but I think we need to be careful about what we're talking specifically so we know whether layered on makes sense, integrated with makes sense. But I don't see this as an overlay. I see it as Internet, pure and simple, what we've had and what we will have.
I think the debate was a little bit also triggered by the fact that the ONS is on top of the DNS, and so there's a relationship. And I think also discussions in the European Commission, it's my understanding, you mentioned that data monopolies, which are emerging, and management questions, is the ONS just, and the relationship between ONS and DNS. This has raised some questions. We have not yet full clarity whether it's different, whether it's the same, or, just nothing need. Do we have one route or alternative routes or whatever? These are also a number of questions, but I think probably Massimiliano, who is doing, with GS1, the real work, we listen to him. What is the business and commercial perspective, and probably Scott also could then add something how he sees it, because I think it's about numbers and allocation numbers. Do we have a special need, to have allocation policies, if we link RFID chips to objects and IP version 6 addresses, or is it just what we are doing, in the day-to-day operation with IP address allocation? But first, Massimiliano and then Scott.
Thank you, Wolfgang, and good morning, everybody. Well, luckily for society, I'm not doing the ONS, otherwise it wouldn't function. I'm not an engineering, so I work for GS1. A quick point about the organization. It's a platform that has been set up by companies in originally the fast mover consumer goods in the 70s to standardize the way to identify goods in the supply value chain so that the management of the supply value chain could be made more effective. And this has developed in a set of standards that was adopted by companies that belong to the GS1 consortium worldwide, and in a consortium that has around 1.5 million companies on over 150 countries, that only looks at ways to manage the information that are related to object identifier for a specific set of objects, which are the goods in the fast mover consumer goods, and in other industries that are now starting to use identifier that are based on the experience developed by GS1 that was embedded in the barcodes in the 70s and 80s. So the companies we work with are just one set of companies that might want to identify things. There are a lot of other things out there that will be identified probably in different ways. The natural evolution of the identification work that GS1 has been carrying out was the RFID standards, a consortium promoted by the MIT and several other universities, standardized the EPC global system of identification that was embedded in a particular use of RFID, which is not the only one of the market. Is used by a number of companies worldwide, but it does not aim to be the reference model. It's just one model that has emerged out of companies' interest and usage, but is by no means a standard that pretends to be a reference standard for the entire application to come. So the point where the companies we work with come to this discussion is to understand how these different systems of identification, of identifying things, will be interrelated in the future. As Avril and the others have very clearly pointed out, the Internet of Things, whatever it really means, and I'm sure that people are not yet clear about what we want to put into this basket, is something that will develop in the next 5, 10, 15 years by adding a lot of different pieces to this picture. And I think that the concern that industry has at this stage is that the nature of the problem is quite tricky because it involves two basic dimensions. One is the interface between developing technologies and business use that will use those technologies to identify things, to exchange information, to build services on those information, and the challenge that finding ways to form rules around those business needs will need to be global by definition, and not just because the Internet is part of the world Internet of Things, but because those applications might be global in nature. Some others might be local, because systems of objects might want to interact with one another just in a closed environment. But there will be many different approaches to the various usage of information that are linked, that are generated by things or sensors or whatever it's referred to as thing. So I think the challenge that industry sees in the exercise that was started by the Commission and that we think is a very useful one in the process that the Commission has set up is to find a way to sort of put together these two elements, an evolving technology and evolving business uses of those technologies with an international settings of different actors that are involved in this discussion, at the government level, at the consumer level, at the industry level. So I think that the exercise that was started by the European Commission is interesting because it tries to put together different points of view to identify what are the issues that may merit to be discussed at the government level and what other issue may more adequately be sort of addressed by the technical community or by the business community. And I think at this stage, the interesting question to see, going forward, what the European Commission work will do, is, I think, to come up with at least the right question that will need to be then worked on. So I think it's really early days to understand what's the role of public policy. There are obviously some overarching themes that are also present in other debates. The cloud computing one that we've heard yesterday addressed in different workshops was pointing at very similar questions around privacy, security, interoperability, standards. So I think that there are commonalities in the overarching concern from the public policy point of view, how to make sure that those technologies evolve in a way that benefit people that use them. So I think it's important that government get involved early on in the discussion, but it's really very difficult to understand at this stage what will be the issue on which we will need government intervention or government sort of work to develop a framework of rules around the evolving realities of the Internet of Things. Thank you.
Thank you, Massimiliano. I think one of the public policy issues which are involved are certainly the privacy issues, and in particular, if we look into the so-called rendezvous point when the object meets the subject, or what I think Afri said also, so that you are surrounded by 20, 30 objects which can then be linked to you, and then tracing and tracking has another dimension. The question is this a specific Internet of Things privacy question, or is this a general privacy question? Which when you started saying, okay, already in the early days behind the computer, so the tracing and tracking was possible for an individual. So that means is there a new element in the so-called objects, when objects are linked and can be linked to the person, or is it, a traditional question? So the concepts like the right to silence the chip is, one of the answers. Bernard Mou is not here from the French ministry, but I think he was the guy who was pushing for to label this as a new human right. So that means that certainly the question is that the individual should have control over the data. The question is, how this can be realized and what policies are needed. But in my eyes, this is not a specific Internet of Things privacy issue. It's a general privacy issue for our virtual world. And this is also linked certainly to IP addresses, because there is a debate also with IP addresses. IP version 6 enables, now that you give each person, or the 6 billion people of the world, a permanent IP address, and then via your IP address, from your birth until the end of your life, everything can be recorded. It has nothing to do with the Internet of Things. So that's one of the scenarios which are totally untrue. But Scott, you will bring a little bit more light into these doomsday scenarios.
It would be a doomsday scenario, indeed. But let's actually pop up a level and go back a little bit and talk about what an IP address is, either a version 4 address or a version 6 address. It is a combination of a locator and an identifier. And it's a context-specific locator and identifier. It locates within a particular network or subnet. That particular network could be the internet, or it could be some private network in somebody's backyard. But it's a combination of locator and identifier. The idea of assigning addresses, V6 addresses, because that's where we got the numbers of them, to objects independent of where they're located, it doesn't make any sense, because the address contains a locator function. You can do this in the telephone world. You could assign people telephone numbers from birth and emboson them on their foreheads or whatever you want to do. Because in the telephone world, when you initiate a call, it does a lookup to match, to do a matching between that number and the location of where you really are. So if I'm going to call you, I use a telephone number. The first thing that happens is that the system goes and does a lookup, which can take seconds, to find out where you actually are and what the underlying network locator is for you. You're in the telephone network. That doesn't work in Internet Protocol because you'd have to do that lookup on every packet, and doing seconds of lookup on every packet just doesn't technically work. So the idea of assigning or using IPv6 addresses as something other than a network address determiner, a routing tag, doesn't make any technical sense. It's been proposed a number of times. Sony proposed to burn a v6 address in all of their consumer products a while back, but it simply wouldn't work. The routing tables would explode, or you'd have to have this level of indirection of lookup, and we don't have the time to do the lookup on a datagram protocol. So we can put that aside as a non-starter technically. We can't do that. But I would go back to what the general theme here has been, is about identifiers. Megan talked about unique identifiers, and I think that's the wrong concept. They're contextually unique. We talked about the RFIDs. There are a number of different flavors of RFID standards. What's it used for? There's a different RFID standard that's used on the RFIDs that are on the tanks than the ones on the crates and going across the Atlantic. There are different number sequences. They mean different things. They are unique within the context of that meaning. And what Bob was talking about in terms of, is this just the Internet and its ways to use it? Yes, you don't use the underlying network identifier, which actually is not the IP address, it's MAC addresses or something like that, to identify things at a higher level. That's one of the abstractions that's a brilliant move in the Internet Protocol and the Internet in general, is you've got these layers of identifiers. Got the bottom layer identifier, which just tells it how on the wireless network in the room the packet is going to get to my machine versus Aubrey's machine. That's the MAC address, the Media Access Control Address. On top of that is the IP address that's mapped locally between the IP address and the MAC address. So the packet that's actually delivered is delivered using the MAC address. It's not delivered doing the IP address at the local LAN level. And then above that's the DNS. The DNS is a way to map a human-friendly name into a temporary IP address. I say temporary because you can change it with the name staying the same. So we've got these layers of ways to map identifiers. I don't see any particular difference with the Internet of Things. We've got different identifiers with RFIDs and other and Zigbee identifiers and all kinds of different local contextual identifiers. There's no particular reason that they need to be in any way universal. That doesn't mean there isn't a privacy issue. V6, one of the modes of V6 is to map the MAC address into the low order bits of the V6 address. That's only one of the mechanisms. You can use a random number in addition to that. You don't have to use a MAC address there. But as long as you are communicating and the packets are coming, the data is coming from you going to someplace else, at least for a period of time, the time I'm sitting in this room with this laptop doing anything, it's going to have the same IP address on it. When I move to a room downstairs, it may have got a different IP address. But for a particular period of time, that's identifying me. It's identifying all of the things I do for a particular period of time. And there's a real privacy issue with that. It's not one that's going to be easily solved, and I don't think it's one that's even remotely specific to the Internet of Things. It is what Bob said. It is what we've already got. It's the problems we already have. So that's it's not. I agreed with Bob that it's not treating the Internet of Things conceptually as an overlay network is probably the wrong conceptual mechanism. But in reality, that's what it is. But the whole Internet is overlay networks. The whole Internet is a way to make use of a transport system for many different functions, and each of those functions can be seen as an overlay network. So.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would open now the floor for discussion or questions. We have done Cabrio in Brussels, but as Sandra just told me, though, that the audio doesn't work. He has 5 or 6 slides, and I don't know whether we should start now with the slides or whether we should just use, the spirit of the room and to continue with the debate. And we certainly, can also put the slides then online so that you can go that, or at the end of the day, end of the discussion, we just go through the slides. And he is not accessible now via audio. Okay.
So I will say, this is Brian Huseman from Intel Corporation. Dan Caprio has emailed me and said he cannot hear, so he actually has sent me his slides and has asked if I could just speak generally to them, if that's okay.
This would be wonderful. So that means you fit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. And then Afi will respond to some of the issues raised by other panelists. So then let's do the presentation, from Dan, and then we have more than half an hour, for interactive dialogue. I think that's good. By the way, he is a member of this European EU task force, and he's in Brussels now for this special meeting, but he's based in Washington.
So I will try to channel Dan as much as possible. Again, my name is Brian Huseman from Intel Corporation. So going to the second slide. So Dan, I think, is talking about some of the issues we've been talking about, which is that privacy is going to be a key element of the Internet of Things and of this continuum of devices. And let me just kind of give my personal example. In Intel, we kind of are referring to the Internet of Things as the computing continuum, where all of your devices will be connected to each other. They'll be able to speak to each other. There's going to be great benefits. Your cell phone will know that you're in your car, and it will read your text messages out loud to you, as opposed to having them be on the phone. You will be able to turn your oven on and off via your cell phone or other remote computing devices. I mean, there'll be great benefits to consumers, but there obviously are privacy issues, and consumers must trust that the free flow of information between these devices will be private and secure. So this is what Dan is talking about how we need to protect privacy and enable innovation. Next slide. He's talking about how the Internet of Things is changing from computing from a centralized model to one that's distributed, and he's talked about some of the things we've already talked about what this reflects. Next slide. So Dan's main question is, what should the framework be for this new Internet of Things concept, and is asking whether the current privacy model is applicable in this new world of pervasive computing, where everything is connected to each other and to the Internet. And Dan believes that the fair information practices are still important, but that some of these long-standing principles need to be considered. On the next slide, he talks about challenges. Next slide, yes. And I think this is really the key slide here. So if we take as the premise that the fair information practices are still important in guiding, how are those applied to this pervasive computing world? Do we want to treat all data equally? How do you provide notice and consent when you're talking about a computer that's in your refrigerator or your oven or some other device? What does transparency mean about that? How do you incorporate privacy by design into all of these new computing devices? And how can consumers have access to this information if there's really not a direct interaction between the computer and the computing device? I think this slide is what we've started to discuss, and I think these are the key challenges of this this new world. If you can go to the next slide. In addition, some of these challenges are opportunities. If we take these concepts of privacy by design and privacy impact assessments as key to the new world of the computing continuum, they can be means to assess and mitigate the risks that we have. And I think privacy by design is really, just speaking personally, is very, very key to that, to making sure that as we have all these new technologies and these connected devices, that we do incorporate privacy protections from the get-go. And then Dan also believes that we need to focus on protecting the most sensitive information and do risk assessments for that information. So the next slide, his last one, is takeaways. Dan encourages all stakeholders to become involved in the upcoming commission consultation process that was mentioned. He thinks that we should not focus on such concepts as the right to be forgotten and what he calls the right to the silence of chips, but instead more on some of these fundamental issues that we've been talking about. And then he also thinks we need to spend time on identifying what is actually sensitive and providing for enforcement mechanisms for that information. So those are his slides. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much. So we have this dimension here. So we were criticized, from some other groups saying, we do not have the consumer voice here among the speakers. So that's certainly a missing point, but there will be other opportunities. And also when we meet this afternoon for this dynamic coalition meeting, probably, we can try to, look for partners who would represent more the consumer side. But Avri and Fiona, wanted to respond to some of the statements here, and I also invite McTim and you. So that means we have Avri, Fiona, McTim, you, somebody else? Okay, yeah, Megan. Okay, Avri.
Okay, thank you. I actually appreciated the comments. I actually think, at least in the way I'm identifying things, there's less disagreement than you see, or than you see. One of the realities that I'm accepting is that all of these objects, from the side of beef to the piece of leather in a saddlebag, or the steak that we do or don't eat, will not always be in the context of an IP network. That it won't always be possible as you have an identifier at the application level translated down to an IP network. So I think, first of all, that global, that says this is an overlay of just the internet as we know it, and I apologize for misusing the word that you've marked and defining it in many ways. I have no other way to talk about it other than we're using the internet in many meetings, and unfortunately, as a researcher and somebody that came out of philosophy school, I have to take, so I apologize for misusing a branded word. So I think that notion of, yes, all layering is an overlay is indeed true. In this case, I think that we are overlaying more than just the internet as we know it. The internet as defined today in its addressing, naming, and various principles. I think the view that you present that, and I feel it's somewhat utopian, but it's a great goal, that we come up with an overarching abstraction so that all names could, at their meta level, be in a similar system, so that we could move from one set of, and in fact I think we already have much of the ability to do that in the URL system that allows you to define a name in a context with an authority, and the meaning of the name is defined by the context that is also included in the name. So I think a lot of those tools exist. So I actually think that the wording is different. I think that I'm seeing a perhaps more diverse reality of many different people coming into this, many different people starting to name things, starting to move things, and us needing to find a way to perhaps reach that utopian goal of a global metadata, a global meta way of expressing things. But it's going to take us a while to get there, and that's where an architecture of technology. And governance comes in as if the way to do it is in a meta-naming system, how do we arrive at that? Is there one existence that works for us, or is there something that goes beyond that? There are many different groups that are all striving to do this at the moment, and each one of them is going to need to be connected to the other, and we're going to need to find the way to move from the cow in the field to the multiple stakes, so that the cow in the field gets sick, the multiple stakeholders are notified. That was accidental. I apologize.
But we don't need to move from the cow in the field to the desk in front of us.
Unless we have a leather-bound notebook.
But in fact, we used to have something called a Bessie tracker, where you actually did. You had to do every single thing it ate right up to the bill of sale. And so all that information had to be managed. They wanted to use our digital object architecture. They didn't get their funding, unfortunately, so it didn't happen.
And then Megan.
Sure,
Thank you, Wolfgang. I just wanted to point out that we are all consumers. I don't think we need to bring in a consumer perspective. I mean, this is something, the Internet of Things and our personal information, whether it's our fridges ordering food or what's on our phones, this is something we all need to be concerned about. Thanks.
Oh, Fiona now.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to maybe expand a little bit. So I started out by saying, in response to all the activity that the Commission has on specific to Internet of Things, that we as the U.S. government weren't doing anything specific to that. We are doing lots of other things, and we are sort of actively engaging and looking at copyright, free flow of information, privacy, cybersecurity, and we have active consultations. We're actually trying to use the multi-stakeholder model domestically, and hopefully in the coming months or so we'll be issuing an administration paper on specific to privacy. And I think what we're seeing, though, I would sort of say this applies to cloud computing as well. A lot of these policy issues cut across these different subsections, and that's how we're looking at it. And that's why I don't think you see a very active consideration in the U.S. government on Internet of Things specifically. We're looking at it as, just like cloud computing, just like Internet of Things, all these different issues. Privacy is going to cut across all of them. So you need a regime that you can deal with all of them, as a collective. And what we're looking at on privacy is sort of fundamental baseline legislation of the Consumer Bill of Rights, and then a multi-stakeholder process to develop sector-specific or industry codes of conduct. And potentially, as these things evolve, you could have something on one of these topics. So I didn't want to leave you with the impression, for those that are not aware of what we're doing in the U.S., that we're not doing anything. It's just not specifically directed based on technologies, whether it's Internet of Things, whatever that may mean. I still, even after listening to very smart people in the room, still don't think anyone really knows or agrees what it is, or like on cloud computing or things like that. So.
Hello, I'm Athena Fraguli from the RIPE NCC. I would like to address the point you made, Wolfgang, about the way we allocate IP addresses and whether there will be a change to that. Well, the way we allocate IP addresses is defined by the policies, by the community. Whenever there is a need to adapt these policies, the community does it. No matter V4, V6, the procedures to adapt the policies according to the needs of the community are there.
Thank you, Megan.
Thanks. Well, let me start from the upper layer, as you would like to say it, according to the technicians. But I think there are a couple of things. First of all, let me underline that in the European Commission and in the European Union, because the Union involves the Parliament, Member States, everyone else, but the work that we're doing in the Commission now is not excluding aspects like cloud or any other aspects relating to the Internet. We know very well that the Internet of Things is just one aspect of the Internet as a whole. So we're not thinking in any way of establishing a governance framework that would be exclusive to the Internet of Things. The reason we're looking at the Internet of Things is that we think there are some very particular issues that arise in this context relating to privacy, data protection, etc., interoperability, etc., that need a particular look, let's put it that way. And we're also looking at cloud computing, and there are a whole series of issues. These are all interrelated. There's no question about that. So that's just, I hope, to put you a little bit at ease. And we're not developing nefarious regulatory or legislative provisions that would block any further development or set certain standards that no one else could meet, etc. So, as I said at the very beginning, this is work that is taken in a global context, in the context of the internet, etc. So, at the other side, I think it deserves some further reflection and some further study. So that's what we're doing. With respect to consumers, it's true, we are all consumers, but we perhaps have a particular view that other consumers don't have. And that's why I think in the public consultation it will be very important to hear what consumer associations and consumer groups and civil society have to say. And this means, of course, too, that the consultation, the questions that we ask, have to be posed in a very clear manner so that we clearly identify what we're talking about. And then with respect to identifiers, I did speak about unique identifiers, but I don't mean that we should necessarily establish either a new system or, and I don't know any of the technical aspects, so I leave that all to you. But what is important is that when these identifiers are used and that they relate to each other and they manage things, that they work in an interoperable way, that they work around the world, that they don't cause trouble on the internet, and as you have pointed out very well, and it's our concern too, that we respect privacy concerns, etc. So there are lots of other issues, but I think I'll leave them for you to.
Thank you very much. We have still a quarter of an hour for discussion, so it's you and then Bob again and then you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Sophie Le Palais from GS1 France. I'd like to come back on the comment or the question that to know if the Internet of Things is an overlay of the Internet. I will speak just about what I know, the Internet of Things regarding fast-moving consumer goods, like my colleague Massimiliano was speaking about. You have to be aware that to track and trace products, to give them identifier, is something that we are doing for 30 years. It's as old as the Internet in itself. So from our perspective, we could also think that the Internet is an overlay for our system. Because we are doing that for 30 years, and now we think the Internet is a good tool. We are going to integrate these protocols into our systems. So perhaps the reality of this is there is a network infrastructure. There is a physical world. Both have been existing for 30 years with their own problems, their own usage, and their own governance. And now we are trying to merge them. What will be the outcome? We still don't know. But I think we should be we should advance very carefully, but not saying that one is going to put the governance on the other or vice versa. It's something that we have to think upon, and you don't have to forget that on the physical part of the Internet of Things, there are usages, and these usages involve physical products, and we have also to take into account what we want to do with these physical products. There are processes between partners about how to exchange physically goods. You cannot forget these practices, these business practices. Thank you very much.
Sophie, this was very, very helpful. I think that it's really a perspective we sometimes, ignore. But, the good thing with the Internet is it brings together everything with everything. And sometimes, we have a narrow perspective, just looking at the world from the Internet perspective. But there's also a world outside the Internet, and now all this comes together. I think there was you and then Bob.
Louise Bennett, BCS. I wanted just to make a comment on the privacy issue with the Internet of Things. I think the key thing here is associating things like your refrigerator and the food in it with the individual is just the same as associating other attributes with an individual, like their height, their weight, etc., and where they're located. I think the key thing, if you're considering privacy issues in this area, is the sensitivity of that data, because that data becomes very sensitive if what you're associating is the medicines you're taking, perhaps, or diagnostics that are associated with you. So I think the key thing on privacy, as with all other attributes associated with an individual, is to focus on the things that really are sensitive and make sure you're protecting them well. And I don't see that it's any different from the protection of other sensitive data.
Okay, and in other areas we have to opt-in or opt-out option as a policy for this, which makes the differentiation between sensitive and non-sensitive data, that you have different approaches. So insofar you can really ask the question, what is the specific privacy dimension of the Internet of Things, or is this a general privacy issue, which is growing and growing and growing with more and more applications, and you have the same issues more or less also in Facebook or in social networks and search engines, and also with the Internet of Things. So is there a difference? My answer would be no. So it's the same challenge, that whether we are on Facebook, whether we are surrounded by objects, or whether we do our search via Google and leave a lot of private things in the data stores of the search engine. I think there were Bob, yeah.
So
Okay.
just a brief comment on what was just said a moment before, and then I get to the comment that I wanted to make. The one comment about your remarks is that I don't think you have to worry about whether what you're doing is overlaid on the internet or vice versa, because ultimately it's all going to be integrated together, and that isn't to say you won't have some more issues to worry about that you didn't have before, because you almost surely will. But I think to the extent that people are working in different areas, they will continue to be in charge and control of those areas, setting the standards, protocols, procedures. They'll just have another way to interact with a larger community. So I wouldn't worry too much about getting the definitions there. Exactly right. If I look at the internet writ large, there are only a few really important principles that have stood the test of time. We heard some of it yesterday in the session that Scott was involved in, and a number of others, but clearly open architecture is one of the principles that has come through, and I think another one that none of us really recognize the importance of, but I think is clearly understood widely now, is this multi-stakeholder approach to figuring out what to do and where things should go, particularly in terms of how the social structures work. And the third one that I was pointing out was, understanding how to deal with meta-level approaches to problems rather than specific technology approaches. If you think about the internet as a technology contribution, it's been around for 40 years, may last another 40 or maybe well beyond that. There are few technologies that last that long. And if you'd ask me, why is it that it's lasted that long? I would say it's because it's not a contribution that's specific about the technology evolutions that take place. It was not about any particular network, ATM or otherwise, depending on what the carriers thought. It was always a level above. You can have whatever network you want. This is a way of making them work together. You can have whatever computing you want. This is a way of making it work together. You can have whatever application. So it wasn't defining that. It was a meta-level structural approach to enabling this all to take place. And in fact, it took time to evolve because it didn't come prescribed from one place with all the applications and all of the networks done by others. So it had to evolve. So let me talk about how this evolution is now taking place in the identifier world. To get to the point that you had made before. When we did the very first network, which was the ARPANET, all of the addressing was done by wire. You say, address this machine, it was on wire 1, that machine was on wire 2, this machine was on wire 3. There's no way that kind of description could ever be persistent. In fact, the ARPANET went away in 1990, it was decommissioned, and the notion of wire 1 on the ARPANET is a conceptual figment at this point, because there's no reality there. Furthermore, all it was telling you was that's where the machine was, and if you wanted to do anything, you had to essentially manipulate that machine with your fingers on a keyboard. When we got into the multiple network environment, the wire then might have gone, and in fact did in most cases, to another network. And so it wasn't sufficient to say, send this to the computer that's out that wire, because that was another net. This is the reason why IP addresses were introduced. The domain name system was simply a simple way of having people not have to remember IP addresses. I used to keep them all on a index card in my pocket. It made no sense to go down that path, and that's why we picked the DNS. When the web came along, they went one step further, and they said, we want to actually talk about the information in a particular file on a particular machine, and which is what the URL now describes. What we've been pursuing for now more than 20 years, and which is pretty widely adopted in different quarters, is the idea every one of those is technology specific. But what we were looking at is a way of actually identifying the data structure itself, namely the set of bits. And that's why the publishers found this approach so interesting, because when they put something on the digital bookshelf, whether it's an electronic journal or it could be a government that's putting out official documents that they want to preserve for posterity, they don't want to have somebody come back in 100 or 1,000 years, assuming they manage it properly, and say, let's see, what was on wire 1 on the internet 1,000 years ago, or what did the following IP address mean way back then, or what was in this file on that particular computer. They want to basically get the information. And so the idea of addressing the data structure itself, seems to me, is a meta-level concept that is not only very powerful, but is the way we need to go in the future. Now, there are various ways we can do it. We've got an approach. People will come up with different approaches all over the place, and ultimately interoperability is what's really critical. So I think it's important to really understand that moving to this meta level whenever we can, and getting ourselves unhooked from the technology of the day is really what's essential to making this thing work. And there's no area where I think this is going to be more important than at the interfaces between the machines and devices themselves. If we invest in building a good medical electronics infrastructure in the United States, for example, you've got to assume other countries of the world are going to do things maybe slightly differently. And even if we could get agreement globally on what the interconnection should be, you know how hard it's been to go from IPv4 to v6. It's going to be impossible to change that interconnection mechanism, because you'd have to get everybody in the world to change it if you want to get interconnections. Having a meta-level interconnect strategy, and I'm not going to get into what that could be today. We've got some thoughts on that. Other people probably do as well. But a meta-level interconnect strategy will allow us to change and evolve the basic interconnection structure over time to meet needs in the future. So that's a very important third policy, and it comes into play in virtually every one of the discussions we're likely to have in the future on interconnectivity.
Yes, Scott.
I want to back into more about overlay networks. Bob mentioned that the ARPANET started out as addressing wires. That's how the phone system, I mentioned the phone numbers earlier, but I didn't go back a little bit far enough, and I think Bob brought that point back. Phone numbers used to be the way the phone system found you. They were locators only. They were a way that different parts of the phone number were saying down to, it's this wire. It's this physical wire going to this physical location. The first branch away from that was free call numbers, 800 numbers in the U.S. and that sort of number elsewhere, where the number no longer referred to a particular telephone. It referred to a conception of somebody's phone. And the way that was done was a lookup. You dial the 800 number, it looked up and found a real phone number, which was the real locator for the real physical telephone. Got fancier. 1-800-Domino's got you the closest Domino's pizza shop, things like that. But it was a way to do this mapping of a conceptual name for something to a particular physical instance of that. In wherever number portability has been added in the phone system, that is expanded this from beyond free phone calls to everything. So now, whenever you dial a phone in the U.S., it always does that lookup, because any one of those numbers could have been moved between carriers and therefore could have been moved between the underlying networks and therefore no longer identify a physical wire. They're identifying the person. We've done talking a lot about identifiers. So the phone number which identifies the physical wire that goes to my desk at home is a identifier. When you dial my phone number, you're not dialing that number. You're dialing another identifier. It gets mapped, just like the IP address gets mapped into the MAC address or the DNS name gets mapped into an IP address. These are contextually specific identifiers. There is no reason that the underlying phone number that's addressing the phone on my desk has to be global. There's no reason at all that it has to be global. There has to be a way for me to get to it from other phones. But there doesn't have to be a way for me to get to it from my refrigerator. My refrigerator is not going to call my phone, I hope. I don't want it to. So when we're talking about overlays, I consider overlay in a different context, but it's still the same idea, which is I don't necessarily need to be able to, all on a global scale, from any device talk to any other device, because the devices are purpose. Those RFIDs on crates on the Atlantic, I don't need to be able to get a URL to get me to one. The people who are tracking the shipment need to be able to get there. And I might need, if I'm a customer of that company, I might need an interface to say, okay, well, where's my shipment? And then some magic happens at an interface, which then goes and finds out where the crate is by looking up the RFID and returning to me information that's useful to me. Bob mentioned that we have a number of different potentially incompatible systems and medical records and things. Very simple language differences. You're not going to have the same data for everybody. If when I go to look up something, I want something that I can understand. So there'll be interfaces, and those interfaces are connecting together chunks of virtual network, which are overlay networks or whatever. But I don't see a reason to have a global identifier space identifying everything that's in the Internet of Things. You need to have it in the context of the particular application.
Because, we have then to close the
Okay.
workshop. We have still 3 minutes.
I just want to address that Mr. Benham wasn't here, and Dan Caprio from Intel. I'm sorry if I mispronounced.
He's not from Intel.
Oh, he's not?
Yeah,
Okay,
no,
you're from Intel.
yes.
Okay, all right. And he's an attorney in Washington, and so am I. But the privacy issue, it depends upon what you want to have private. And I'd like to take a larger approach to this. You're really talking about, in my humble opinion, managing the information itself. Okay, and here's where you get the representation in digital form, and you can actually have the metadata, what you can do with the data. You can encrypt it in various ways. We talk about digital objects. Because if you have a medical record, then that's what you want to keep private. So it's not an abstract notion, privacy. It should be addressed in context, what your financial records are. And systems for managing that information is what has been a major focus of our attention over the years, and even getting down into the object level. And just one other thing, Scott, with the crate on the ocean, my suggestion was that you could authenticate the bill of lading and actually associate that information about the location of the crate, and even have video if there's a storm at sea and it slips off in the ocean, that then could also be managed as an information resource that you could then communicate, say, with a bank to say, this bill of lading is now have this issue attached to it, and the value then might be reflected differently.
And we're in full agreement on that. I just don't think that the ultimate customer necessarily needs to be able to address that video camera looking at the crate in real time.
No, not in real time, but it's actually just building an architecture that would actually allow for the interoperability, and then the context, of course, would be obviously the thing that would be important.
And what about unauthorized access to this data, which then brings security issues also, and so the risk, so that means, and that's trust question. Can we trust that, the use of the data which is available is really so stops at the border of the purpose? And so that means there are some zones, which at least, can produce some mistrust or suspicion. And so we have to, at least, if we want to have the consumers really accept all these new opportunities, we have to be on the safe side. And have to at least to give answers to questions which are very justified questions. So we have to come to a close now, and I would ask Massimiliano, Afri, Fiona, and then Megan, to very, very short last comment.
I guess that the point of multi-stakeholder approach will be key also in addressing the IoT challenges that we will face going forward. and the cooperation at the international level between all the different players will be a fundamental ingredient of the answer that we will construct to this emerging issue.
Thank you. I want to, in following the tradition of a great role model of mine, I have 3 points I'd like to make. One of the things I think that I've been calling an overlay architecture is what I think, as I listen, is what other people are calling a meta-level abstraction, plus the definition of interconnections, plus a system of lookups. And once you've got all that together, you've created yet another level of abstraction that is what I'm terming the overlay. I think in terms of the privacy, and is one of the things that makes it different, at least appear to me to be different, is one of levels of complexity. I think that you've got much more data from many more sources, more combinations, more movement, more location, and that basically a sort of normal thing from complexity theory, at a certain point, this makes it something that has to be looked at in a different way. Now that's just a thing. And my third point is looking at a history. I don't normally get myself into history, but one of the successes, I think, of the Internet itself was its ability to overlay the telephone network and yet not be restricted to that telephone network, but then to overlay a cable that was drawn or wireless or something. So I think that we're very much in that same sort of notion. Thank you.
Fiona.
I think, it's been interesting to sort of hear the evolution of the issue. I haven't really looked at it in a couple of years. But again, I think still from our perspective, all the policy issues that are being raised aren't specific to the Internet of Things. They're sort of cutting across Internet policy generally. And I think we're looking at it from a much more holistic perspective right now. And we just don't see the demand domestically to narrow in on it in the same way. But, we'll actively follow what the Commission's doing and I think be informed by it. So.
Yeah, thanks. Well, with the risk of repeating exactly what Massimiliano has said, I think that there are 2 very important elements amongst many others. One is the multi-stakeholder element, the international element, and third, I would say, please respond to the public consultation that we will put out towards the end of the year, because what we need is your ideas and your voice in order to develop something that suits us, that doesn't constrain further development, but puts the right things in the right places, let's put it that way.
Thank you very much, and it brings me also to the final announcement that, as Megan has just said, we have still not enough knowledge. We have not still all the clarity. We do not understand every element, and so we have to continue the debate. And the idea was born last year in the IGF in Vilnius, to reactivate the dynamic collision on the Internet of Things. So we use the established terminology, even if we have some doubts whether this is the right terminology. But, if you have introduced the terminology, then sometimes, you cannot escape from it, like the digital divide, which is also a bad terminology, but everybody understands what it is. And so is also with the dynamic collision on the Internet of Things. I invite you to join. The meeting is the first afternoon session today, and so that we can discuss a little bit what should be the next steps. Should we, have papers? Should there be a workshop or seminars where we can continue the debate and probably plan another discussion on the forthcoming IGF in the year 2012? Because I think here we need still more debate and more multi-stakeholder debate, so that we get all the perspectives. It's not the time at the moment to make any decisions or conclusions or introduce policies or rules. But if we come after a discussion, to the result, that's a general question. There is no need to do anything. This would be also a very productive result. But then we are on the safe side and say we went through a process and now we understand why we do not need anything. But if we need anything, then we have to do something. But this is still an open question. I thank you for your debate, for the discussion, and I hope you will join us with this dynamic collision. So we hope to collect also email addresses that we can inform you, and I can only support what Megan has said. The public consultation process in the European Union is a very good opportunity, not only for Europeans, but for the rest of the world. And please make use of this.
And
thank you.
Remind them the room, perhaps.
Yeah, at the room for the dynamic collision is conference room 3. That's in the very ground floor.
Right after lunch.
Yeah, right after lunch. Thank you. Did you enjoy the publication?